How long do you think really is 4 years? Is it a long time? I mean, it's sort of the US presidential election cycle. 4 years ago, I uploaded my first live action political video to YouTube. 4 years really doesn't seem like a very long time, at least to me. And in light of the content of that video I uploaded 4 years ago, I was thinking of asking a question of the community because to me it seems more relevant than ever before. Maybe not to you, but definitely to me. And basically, the question is just, what do you think about democracy, and not only the role of democracy in a globalized world or as an agenda that is aggressively promoted by the United States and her allies, but just democracy in general as a philosophy or an ideology that is either effective or ineffective at managing a global civilization, or even not a global civilization if you want to pare it down a bit and just say a civilization on a state by state basis. Really, what I'm asking is, do you think democracy is up to the challenge? And when you say democracy, or when I say democracy, I don't really mean democracy. In a representative democracy, you have two factions, sort of. You have the people, and then you have the representatives that kind of collate and assess the will of the people and then turn that into policy. I mean, it's a lot more complicated than that, but that's just an overly simplified analysis for the sake of discussion. So, in a system like that, where you basically have the will of the people making the policy, is that really enough to maintain civility and stability in the future in a globalized world where we deal with things like economic crisis and ecological crisis and all sorts of other crisis on more or less a day-to-day basis? I think that kind of seems like the status quo right now. It's like as soon as a crisis ends, another one begins, or actually, it's more like in the middle of one crisis, another crisis begins. Is democracy up to the task of handling this kind of a perpetual crisis scenario? And if not, then what's the alternative? I've always been anti-fascist. In fact, I think fascism is probably my least liked form of government. But at the same time, I think that fascism is probably the most efficient and effective form of government, and probably the form of government that is most uh, capable when it comes to dealing with a state of perpetual crisis. So I think there's kind of a challenge there, that in the future we definitely have a challenge for democracy, whether or not it can withstand and endure or even cope with sort of a world that is out of control versus other forms of government like fascism or anarchy, which isn't really a government, but it's a system by which things get done. Whether or not there's an alternative system that can deal with crisis more effectively than democracy. Like, some might say that China with a communistic system, which I've actually been anti-communism for a long time as well, but some people might say that China is better able to cope with this sort of perpetual crisis than a country like the United States or Europe or any other of the countries that seems to operate under the philosophy that the people ultimately know what's best for themselves. So, just kind of throwing that out there. It's been 4 years. I don't really think anything has changed whatsoever, which to me isn't a huge surprise since, 4 years really isn't a very long time, and things change very, very slowly in the geopolitical space unless there's some kind of catastrophe or coup or major upheaval. So, what do you think? What what kind of future can we expect for democracy and in the next 10, 15 years, maybe even the next 4 or 8 years? Do you think we're going to see sort of the final phase of democracy morphing into fascism in order to cope with the impending crisis that always seems to be around the corner? For example, the government has plans to put drones in domestic airspace to basically monitor the population. We have news recently released that the NSA has dossiers for every single American, apparently, and basically we just have sort of a situation arising where our democracy is eroding sort of at an unprecedented rate, and yet at the same time we have American foreign policy being utterly obsessed with the idea of spreading democracy to the rest of the world, which I find very intriguing, this sort of schizophrenia in our political space on these issues. In a way, it almost seems like we need to start spreading democracy back in our own country because we're losing it. And I really don't want to live in a fascism. I don't know about you, but that's not my idea of a good way of life. But at the same time, with all this propaganda about terrorism and everything, there comes a point where you have to just kind of accept the fact that things are spiraling out of control, in which case, you need someone to take charge. And if the people aren't up to the challenge, if they won't even take responsibility for their own way of life, or their own liberty, then really what's the alternative? Is there an alternative? So that's really the question that I'm asking in this video, in light of the video I made 4 years ago. What's the alternative? Do you think we're gonna find a solution? Thanks for watching.